They say respect is earned in silence, but disrespect echoes forever. It was late September 1936, and a message arrived in Harlem that would reshape the underworld power structure of New York City for the next 30 years. The message wasn't delivered with bullets or blood. It came wrapped in laughter. Downtown, in a smoke-filled social club on Mulberry Street, representatives of the Genovese crime family had made their position clear. Harlem was Negro territory, and Negro territory didn't matter. The exact words, according to witnesses who were there, were far worse than that. 6 men sat around a table in Little Italy that night, 5 Italians and 1 messenger who would carry their decision uptown. The Italians were drinking espresso, playing cards, and discussing the distribution of heroin that was beginning to flood into New York through the French Connection. Harlem, they decided, would be a market, not a partner. The black gangsters controlling the numbers rackets, the speakeasies, and the street-level distribution networks would work for them, or they would be replaced. When Stephanie St. Clair, the feared numbers queen of Harlem, heard this through her network, she did something unexpected. She didn't retaliate. She didn't call for war. Instead, she summoned a man who had just been released from Sing Sing Correctional Facility after serving nearly a decade for armed robbery and assault. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, but everyone called him Bumpy. Bumpy Johnson was 31 years old, stood just under 6 feet tall, and had a distinctive bump on the back of his head from a childhood injury, hence the nickname. He'd grown up in Charleston, South Carolina, but moved to Harlem in 1919 as a teenager, right when the neighborhood was transforming into the cultural and criminal capital of Black America. By 1928, he'd already earned a reputation as someone who didn't negotiate, didn't back down, and didn't forget. But prison had changed him, or so people thought. Stephanie St. Clair met him at a restaurant on Lenox Avenue, 3 blocks from the Apollo Theater. It was early October, the air was cooling, and the neighborhood was buzzing with talk of Joe Louis, the boxer who was becoming a symbol of Black pride nationwide. Over coffee, Stephanie laid out the situation. The Italians wanted control. They had the connections and the firepower, and Harlem's independent operators were about to become employees or corpses. "They're laughing at us," she said, her voice low but sharp. "They think we're nothing but street hustlers playing gangster." Bumpy listened. He didn't speak for almost 5 minutes. Then he asked one question. "Do they know Chicago?" Stephanie paused. "What about Chicago?" "They think they invented organized crime," Bumpy said, stirring his coffee slowly. "They didn't. They just made it white. What happened next would become legend. But the truth is even stranger. Bumpy Johnson didn't declare war on the Italian mob. He didn't start a gang conflict or orchestrate a hit. Instead, he bought a train ticket to Chicago, a city that was at that moment the most dangerous place in America, and disappeared for 73 days. When he returned to Harlem in late December 1936, he didn't come back alone. He didn't come back with an army. He came back with something far more dangerous, a blueprint, a system, and the quiet endorsement of the only man in America who truly terrified the Italian Mafia. His name was written in the newspapers almost daily, but few dared to speak it aloud in certain rooms. He controlled politicians, police captains, and judges. He'd survived assassination attempts, federal investigations, and gang wars that left hundreds dead. He operated brothels, gambling dens, and breweries worth millions, and he did it all while shaking hands with mayors and aldermen. Bumpy Johnson had gone to Chicago to meet with Al Capone's inner circle, and when the Italians in New York found out, everything changed. But here's the part that makes this story something more than legend. Bumpy didn't ask for permission, and he didn't beg for help. He went to Chicago to prove a point, that a black man from Harlem could walk into the most powerful criminal network in the Western Hemisphere and walk out as an equal. The Italians in New York laughed when they heard about the trip. They stopped laughing when they realized what he'd brought back. To understand what Bumpy Johnson risked, you have to understand what Harlem was in 1936 and what it wasn't. Harlem in the mid-1930s was in the middle of an identity crisis. The Harlem Renaissance, that explosive period of black art, literature, and music that had made the neighborhood famous worldwide, was fading. The Great Depression had hit black communities harder than almost anywhere else in America. Unemployment in Harlem reached 50% by 1935, compared to 25% nationally. Families who had migrated north during the Great Migration were now crammed into tenement apartments, sometimes 3 families to a 2-bedroom unit. But even in economic collapse, Harlem had power. Cultural power, social power, and criminal power. The numbers racket, an illegal lottery system where people could bet pennies on 3-digit numbers drawn daily, generated an estimated $20 million annually in Harlem alone, according to contemporary reports from the LaGuardia Commission investigation into organized crime. That's roughly $440 million in today's currency. The money flowed through barbershops, grocery stores, beauty salons, and churches. Everyone played the numbers. It was the heartbeat of the underground economy. And at the center of that economy were 3 people: Stephanie St. Clair, known as Madam Queen; Casper Hallstein, a former reporter who built the first organized numbers operation in Harlem; and a younger, more violent enforcer named Bumpy Johnson. Stephanie St. Clair was extraordinary by any measure. Born in Martinique, she'd arrived in Harlem in 1912 and built a criminal empire by the early 1920s, controlling numbers banks and enforcers across more than 40 square blocks. She was known for 3 things: her intelligence, her ruthlessness, and her refusal to pay tribute to white gangsters. She'd gone to war with Dutch Schultz, a psychotic Irish-Jewish mobster who tried to muscle into Harlem in 1931, and she'd survived barely. Casper Hallstein was different. Educated, calculating, and strategic, he understood that the numbers game worked because it was community-based. He employed hundreds of Harlem residents as runners, collectors, and bankers. He donated to schools and churches. He was beloved and feared in equal measure. And then there was Bumpy. Bumpy Johnson wasn't beloved. He wasn't a philanthropist or a community figure. He was a weapon. By the time he was 22, he'd been arrested more than a dozen times. By 25, he'd shot 2 men in separate incidents. Both survived, but the message was clear. By the time he went to Sing Sing in 1928, he was known as the man you sent when talking stopped working. But prison had given him time to think. And in the early 1930s, while he was locked up, the power structure of American organized crime was shifting. The Italian Mafia, specifically the 5 families that would later dominate New York, were consolidating. The Castellammarese War, a brutal mob conflict between 1930 and 1931, had ended with the old guard dead and a new generation in charge. Charles Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky had reorganized the underworld into a commission-based system, essentially a board of directors for crime. It was efficient, it was disciplined, and it was expanding. Dutch Schultz, despite being a brutal enforcer, was not Italian. And by 1935, he'd been killed on the orders of the commission because he was too erratic, too violent, and too much of a liability. His death created a vacuum in Harlem, and the Italians moved in fast. The Genovese family, run at the time by Vito Genovese and later by Frank Costello, saw Harlem as a profit center, not a partnership. They had connections to the docks, to the unions, and most importantly, to the heroin pipeline coming out of Marseille, France. Whoever controlled Harlem's distribution would control millions. When Bumpy Johnson got out of prison in September 1936, he walked into a Harlem that was no longer independent. The Italians were already collecting tribute, already installing their own overseers, already making it clear that black gangsters were middlemen, not bosses. That's when Stephanie St. Clair made the call. She didn't ask Bumpy to fight. She asked him to think. And what he thought was this: if the Italians had learned organization from Chicago, then maybe Chicago could teach Harlem how to survive. It was a gamble. Chicago was 790 miles away. It was controlled by a man, Al Capone, who was now in federal prison for tax evasion, but whose network was still the most sophisticated criminal operation in the country. And Chicago's black underworld, while smaller than Harlem's, had something Harlem didn't: a working relationship with the Italians based on mutual respect, not subjugation. Bumpy Johnson wanted to see how they did it. On October 14, 1936, he boarded the 20th Century Limited, a luxury train that ran from New York to Chicago. He carried one suitcase for $100 in cash and a letter of introduction from a jazz club owner who had connections in both cities. He didn't tell anyone in Harlem where he was going, except Stephanie, and he didn't plan to come back until he had an answer to one question. Could a black man in America build real power, or would he always be someone else's soldier? That question would take 73 days to answer, and the answer would change everything. Chicago in late 1936 was a city still haunted by its own violence. Al Capone had been sentenced to 11 years in federal prison in 1931, and by the time Bumpy Johnson arrived 5 years later, the man who had once ruled the city with bribery, bullets, and brass was deteriorating in Alcatraz, his mind slowly consumed by untreated syphilis. But Capone's organization, the Chicago Outfit, was very much alive. The outfit was now run by Frank Nitti, Capone's former enforcer and treasurer. Nitti was quieter than Capone, less flamboyant, but arguably more dangerous. He understood that the future of organized crime wasn't in bootlegging. Prohibition had ended in 1933, but in gambling, labor racketeering, and political corruption. By 1936, the outfit controlled most of the labor unions in Chicago, had deep connections to Hollywood through extortion rackets, targeting movie studios, and ran illegal gambling operations that generated an estimated $50 million per year. But Chicago also had something New York didn't: a thriving, semi-autonomous black numbers operation known as Policy. Policy in Chicago was controlled by a group of black entrepreneurs who had managed, through a combination of violence, negotiation, and strategic alliances, to maintain a degree of independence from the outfit. The most powerful among them were the Jones brothers, Edward, George, and McKissack Jones, who ran the largest policy wheels on the South Side, serving tens of thousands of black residents daily. The Jones brothers weren't street thugs. They were businessmen. They owned legitimate properties, employed accountants, and maintained meticulous records. They also employed enforcers, paid off police, and ensured that anyone who tried to steal from their operation disappeared quietly. When Bumpy Johnson arrived in Chicago, he didn't go to the outfit first. He went to the South Side. He checked into a modest boarding house on 47th Street, in the heart of Bronzeville, the black neighborhood that mirrored Harlem in culture, but differed in structure. Bronzeville had jazz clubs, speakeasies, and churches just like Harlem, but it also had an uneasy peace with the outfit, a peace built on clearly defined territories and profit-sharing arrangements. Bumpy spent his first week in Chicago just watching. He visited policy stations, observed the runners, studied the flow of money. He talked to barbers, bartenders, and cab drivers. He asked questions that sounded innocent but revealed the architecture of the operation. Who collected? Who counted? Who decided when to pay police? Who handled disputes? What he discovered was a system that was more efficient than Harlem's, but also more fragile. The Jones brothers had independence because they were useful to the outfit. They kept the black community's gambling dollars contained and predictable. But that independence was conditional. If the outfit ever decided the policy wheels were more valuable under direct control, the Jones brothers would have no leverage, unless they had protection. And that's when Bumpy Johnson made a move that would define his entire trip. He requested a meeting with someone who could speak for the outfit. Not Frank Nitti. Nitti didn't meet with outsiders, but someone close enough to matter. The meeting was arranged through a mutual contact, a Southside club owner named Big Jim Martin, who ran a gambling den that served both black and white clientele. On the night of October 29th, 1936, Bumpy Johnson sat down in the back room of Martin's club with a man named Paul the Waiter Ricca. Paul Ricca was one of the most powerful men in the Chicago outfit, though few outside of organized crime knew his name. He was Nitty's right hand, a strategic thinker who preferred negotiation to violence, though he was capable of both. Ricca had fled Italy in 1920 after allegedly killing a man, and he'd risen through the outfit by being smarter and more patient than his rivals. The meeting lasted 3 hours. According to later accounts, some from FBI surveillance reports, others from interviews with people who knew both men, Bumpy Johnson didn't ask for help. He asked for information. Specifically, he wanted to know how Chicago's black operators had negotiated their independence, and whether the outfit respected strength or simply tolerated it until it became inconvenient. Ricca, reportedly, appreciated the directness. "Strength without structure is just noise," he allegedly told Bumpy. "You want respect, you need 3 things: money that's clean enough to count, power that's quiet enough to keep, and allies who benefit from you staying alive." Bumpy listened. He didn't take notes. He didn't ask follow-up questions immediately. But over the next several weeks, he did something unusual. He studied the outfit not as an enemy, but as a model. He attended illegal prize fights where outfit money flowed through gambling books. He visited after-hours clubs where off-duty police drank for free while outfit enforcers watched the doors. He observed how the outfit used legitimate businesses, laundromats, restaurants, vending machine companies, to move money and establish presence without drawing federal heat. And he learned the most important lesson of all. The outfit didn't control Chicago through fear alone. They controlled it through integration. They were inside the unions, inside the political machine, inside the police department. They didn't rule from the shadows. They ruled from the open, with handshakes and legal paperwork and campaign donations. Harlem, by comparison, was still operating like it was 1925. Flash, violence, and street-level dominance. It worked locally, but it had no infrastructure to resist a sophisticated takeover. Bumpy realized that if Harlem wanted to survive the Italian mob's encroachment, it couldn't just fight back. It had to evolve. In mid-November, Bumpy had a second meeting with Paul Ricca. This time, he brought a proposal. He wanted to establish a direct working relationship between Harlem's numbers operators and the Chicago outfit, not as subordinates, but as regional partners. Harlem would remain independent in operations, but would adopt the outfit's methods for money management, political protection, and organizational discipline. In exchange, the outfit would signal to the New York families that Harlem had Chicago's endorsement. It was audacious. It was risky. And according to some accounts, Ricca almost laughed. But he didn't. Instead, he asked one question: "Can you deliver, Harlem?" Bumpy Johnson didn't answer immediately, because the truth was he wasn't sure. Stephanie St. Clair had influence, but Harlem was fragmented. Dozens of independent operators, each with their own territory, each with their own pride. Unifying them would be nearly impossible, unless they had a reason to believe it would work. Ricca, seeing the hesitation, made a counteroffer. He would arrange for Bumpy to meet with someone who could legitimize the idea. Not in Chicago, but in New York. Someone the Italian families respected, even feared. Someone who could make the introduction that mattered. That someone was Meyer Lansky. If Bumpy could get Lansky's endorsement, Ricca said, the New York families would have to take him seriously. And if they took him seriously, Harlem could survive. But getting a Lansky meant going back to New York, not as a supplicant, but as someone who'd earned the right to ask. Bumpy Johnson left Chicago on December 23, 1936. He'd been gone for 70 days. When he stepped off the train at Grand Central Terminal, the city was decorated for Christmas. Snow was falling lightly, and Harlem was waiting. He'd gone to Chicago as an ex-convict with a reputation. He came back as something else entirely. He came back as a strategist. Stephanie St. Clair was waiting for him at the Lenox Avenue apartment she used for business, a third-floor walk-up above a dry cleaner. It was late December, bitterly cold, and the streets of Harlem were quieter than usual. families inside, trying to stretch what little money they had through the holidays. When Bumpy walked in, Stephanie didn't ask about Chicago right away. She handed him a cup of coffee and a folded newspaper. The headline read, "Policy Racket Under New Management. Italian Interests Expand Uptown." The article, published in the New York Age, a black newspaper, was carefully worded, but the message was clear. The Genovese family had installed overseers in several Harlem policy banks. Independent operators were being given a choice: work under new management or close down. 3 operators took the deal, Stephanie said quietly. 2 refused. One of them hasn't been seen in a week. Bumpy set the newspaper down. "They're moving faster than I thought." "They think we're finished," Stephanie replied. "They think you went to Chicago to hide." Bumpy almost smiled at that. Good. Let them think it. Over the next hour, he laid out what he'd learned. He explained the outfit structure, their use of legitimate businesses, their political protection networks. He described how Chicago's black operators maintained independence not through resistance, but through value. They were profitable, predictable, and strategically positioned. The outfit didn't crush them because crushing them would create chaos, and chaos was bad for business. Stephanie listened, her sharp eyes never leaving Bumpy's face. When he finished, she asked the question that mattered. "And Lansky, will he meet with us?" "He'll meet," Bumpy said, "but not with us. With me." It was a calculated distinction. Stephanie St. Clair was brilliant, fearless, and respected in Harlem. But in the world Bumpy was trying to enter, the world of Italian Jewish organized crime syndicates, a woman, especially a black woman, would not be taken seriously at the negotiating table. It was unjust. It was infuriating, but it was reality. Stephanie understood. She didn't like it, but she understood. "When?" she asked. "Soon," Bumpy replied. "But first, we need to show them Harlem isn't for sale." What happened over the next 6 weeks became known in Harlem as the Silent War. It wasn't fought with guns or bombs. It was fought with ledgers, loyalty, and leverage. Bumpy Johnson, working with Stephanie and a small group of trusted operators, began systematically reorganizing Harlem's numbers racket. They didn't confront the Genovese overseers directly. Instead, they made them irrelevant. Independent operators who had resisted Italian control were quietly brought into a new network, a cooperative that pooled resources, shared risks, and maintained meticulous financial records. Runners who had been intimidated into working for the Italians were offered better payouts if they switched back. Policy banks that had been forced to pay tribute were suddenly reporting lower earnings. Their real profits hidden in secondary accounts managed by Stephanie's most trusted bookkeepers. It was a shell game, and it worked because it was boring. The Italians were looking for violence, for drama, for something they could crush. Instead, they found declining revenue and polite confusion. "We're trying, but people aren't playing the numbers like they used to," one Harlem operator told a Genovese enforcer in mid-January 1937. "Maybe it's the economy." The enforcer, a man named Sal Vento who'd been sent uptown specifically to manage the Harlem transition, didn't believe it. But he also couldn't prove otherwise. The numbers were down, yes, but they weren't gone. The operation was still running. It was just quieter. By early February 1937, Vento was frustrated enough to report back to his superiors. The message was simple. Harlem was compliant, but not profitable. Maybe it wasn't worth the effort. That's when Bumpy Johnson made his move. Through Paul Ricca's contacts in Chicago, a message was sent to Meyer Lansky, who was at that time operating out of New York and Florida, managing casinos, investments, and partnerships across the country. The message was direct. A Harlem operator wanted to discuss a business arrangement that would benefit everyone involved. Lansky was intrigued, not because he cared about Harlem specifically, but because he was always looking for new revenue streams. And the fact that this operator had connections to the Chicago outfit meant he was worth at least a conversation. The meeting was set for February 18, 1937, at a restaurant in Midtown Manhattan, neutral territory, far from Harlem, far from Little Italy. Bumpy Johnson arrived alone, wearing a tailored suit he'd bought specifically for the occasion. Meyer Lansky was already seated, flanked by two associates who didn't introduce themselves. Lansky was short, thin, and unassuming. He looked like an accountant, which in many ways he was. But he was also one of the most powerful criminals in America, a man who had helped structure the National Crime Syndicate, a man who counted Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello as close friends. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. What exactly was said remains partially unknown. There were no FBI wiretaps, no informants present. But based on later events and interviews, the outline is clear. Bumpy Johnson pitched Harlem not as a conquest, but as a partnership. He acknowledged that the Italians had superior connections and resources, but he argued that Harlem was more valuable as an independent affiliate than as occupied territory. A cooperative relationship would be more profitable, more stable, and less likely to draw federal attention. He backed this up with numbers, real financial data on Harlem's policy rackets, collected and organized by Stephanie St. Clair. He showed profitability projections, customer demographics, and potential growth if the operation was allowed to expand without internal conflict. And then he made the ask, Lansky's endorsement. Not his protection, not his money, just his word that Harlem could be trusted to operate independently while respecting the larger syndicate's interests. Lansky, according to later accounts, asked one question, "Why should I trust you?" Bumpy's answer was simple, because Chicago already does. It was the truth, and it was the leverage he'd gone 790 miles to earn. Lansky didn't commit that day. He said he'd consider it. But 3 weeks later, word filtered back through intermediaries. Lansky had spoken to Frank Costello, the effective head of the Genovese family at the time. The message was simple: leave Harlem's internal operations alone. It's more useful independent. Sal Vinto was pulled out of Harlem by mid-March 1937. The Italian overseers quietly withdrew. Tribute payments stopped. The Italians didn't announce a retreat. They simply stopped pushing. And in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson's reputation transformed overnight. He hadn't fired a shot. He hadn't threatened anyone. He'd done something far more dangerous. He'd negotiated as an equal. But respect in the underworld is conditional, and Bumpy knew it. The Italians had backed off not because they feared him, but because it was more convenient than fighting. That convenience could disappear at any moment, which is why, over the next decade, Bumpy Johnson would spend his energy not on expanding territory, but on building infrastructure. He invested in legitimate businesses, laundromats, nightclubs, real estate. He cultivated relationships with police captains, city councilmen, and judges. He ensured that Harlem's numbers operation was run with the efficiency of a corporation, with records, protocols, and accountability. He became, in essence, what Paul Ricca had described: strong enough to respect, structured enough to trust, and valuable enough to keep alive. But the underworld is never static. And in the years that followed, new threats would emerge: heroin, federal investigations, internal betrayals. Bumpy Johnson would face all of them. And each time, he would survive not because he was the most violent, but because he was the most prepared. By 1940, Bumpy Johnson was no longer just an enforcer. He was a power broker. Harlem's numbers racket was generating more money than ever. Estimates suggest between $30 million and $50 million annually by the early 1940s, a staggering sum during a time when the average annual income in Harlem was less than $1,000. Bumpy didn't control all of it. No one person did. But he controlled enough to matter. More importantly, he controlled the relationships that made the racket possible. He was on good terms with the Italian families, particularly the Genovese and Luciano organizations. He had working relationships with Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Dutch Schultz's former associates. And crucially, he had the loyalty of Harlem itself. The runners, the bookkeepers, the street-level operators who actually move the money. But power in the underworld is always tested, and in the early 1940s, a new kind of threat emerged: heroin. World War II disrupted global trade routes, including the ones that brought narcotics into the United States. But by 1945, as the war ended, those routes reopened, and the Italian Mafia, particularly the Luciano and Genovese families, had positioned themselves as the primary importers of heroin from Europe. The drug was devastating. Unlike the policy racket, which was essentially a voluntary tax on hope, heroin destroyed lives. It created addicts, shattered families, and turned neighborhoods into war zones. And it was enormously profitable. The Italians saw Harlem as the perfect market: a dense population, economic desperation, and existing distribution networks through the numbers racket. They approached Bumpy Johnson with a proposal: use his network to distribute heroin. He would take a percentage, they would supply the product, and everyone would get rich. Bumpy said no. It wasn't a moral stance, exactly. Bumpy Johnson was a criminal, and he'd hurt people in his life. But he understood something the Italians either didn't see or didn't care about. Heroin would destroy the very infrastructure that made Harlem's rackets profitable. Addicts don't play the numbers. They don't hold jobs. They don't maintain families. They become unpredictable, desperate, and dangerous. If Harlem became a heroin market, it would collapse from within. The Italians didn't take the refusal well. In 1946, Bumpy Johnson was arrested on a weapons charge, a setup, according to later accounts. The gun had been planted during a raid on a Lenox Avenue social club. Bumpy was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in Alcatraz. 15 years. In one of the most brutal prisons in America, the same prison where Al Capone had slowly lost his mind. It was meant to break him. It didn't. Bumpy Johnson entered Alcatraz in 1946, and for the next few years, his world shrank to a cell, a cafeteria, and a yard where the most dangerous men in America spent their days trying not to kill each other. But even in Alcatraz, Bumpy maintained his presence. He didn't fight unless forced. He didn't align with any particular gang. He read voraciously: philosophy, history, military strategy. He worked in the prison library, and he cultivated relationships with inmates who would, upon release, remember that Bumpy Johnson had treated them with respect when no one else did. Meanwhile, back in Harlem, the heroin epidemic began. By 1950, it was estimated that nearly 20% of young black men in Harlem were addicted to heroin. The neighborhood that had once been the cultural capital of Black America was now synonymous with crime, addiction, and decay. The policy racket still operated, but it was weakened, fractured by violence and police crackdowns. Stephanie St. Clair, now in her 60s, had largely retired. Many of the independent operators who had worked with Bumpy were either in prison, dead, or working for the Italians under coercive arrangements. Harlem was losing. Bumpy Johnson was released from Alcatraz in 1954 after serving 8 years. He was 49 years old, grayer, thinner, but no less sharp. He returned to a Harlem that barely resembled the one he'd left. If this were a movie, this is the moment where the protagonist launches a campaign of revenge. But Bumpy didn't do that. Instead, he did something more strategic. He started quietly dismantling the heroin networks. He didn't go after the Italians directly. That would have been suicide. Instead, he targeted the street-level dealers, the local enforcers who worked for the mob but lived in Harlem. He used intimidation, bribery, and occasionally violence to shut down distribution points. He funded community programs, youth centers, boxing gyms that gave kids alternatives to the streets. And he rebuilt the numbers racket, this time with even tighter controls and better political protection. By the late 1950s, Harlem's policy wheels were again generating millions, and Bumpy Johnson, now in his 50s, was once again a name that mattered. But the world was changing in ways that even Bumpy couldn't control. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum. Federal authorities were cracking down on organized crime with new tools: wiretaps, RICO statutes, IRS investigations. The Italian Mafia, once untouchable, was being exposed and prosecuted. And Harlem itself was being reshaped by urban renewal projects that displaced thousands of residents. Bumpy Johnson adapted, as he always had. He invested in legitimate businesses, distanced himself from day-to-day criminal operations, and positioned himself as an elder statesman, someone younger gangsters consulted, but who no longer got his hands dirty. But in the mid-1960s, a new generation of criminals emerged. Younger, more reckless, less interested in the old codes. They saw Bumpy as outdated, a relic of a different era. And maybe in some ways he was. On July 7th, 1968, Bumpy Johnson collapsed while eating dinner at a soul food restaurant in Harlem. He was 62 years old. The cause of death was a heart attack, sudden and fatal. There were rumors, of course. Poisoning, a setup, revenge from old enemies. But the truth was probably simpler. A lifetime of stress, violence, prison, and struggle had taken its toll. Bumpy Johnson was buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Hundreds attended the funeral: criminals and community members, police informants, and politicians. It was a strange, complicated tribute to a strange, complicated man. Bumpy Johnson has been dead for more than 50 years, but his name still echoes. He's been portrayed in movies, television shows, and documentaries, sometimes accurately, often not. He's been romanticized as a Robin Hood figure, a protector of Harlem who fought against white oppression. He's been vilified as a gangster who profited from his own community's desperation. Both versions are true, and both are incomplete. The real Bumpy Johnson was a man who existed in the narrow space between survival and power, between exploitation and protection. He ran illegal gambling operations that drained money from poor families, yes. But he also provided jobs, loans, and security in a neighborhood that had been abandoned by legal institutions. He worked with the Italian Mafia, yes. But he also ensured that Harlem maintained a degree of autonomy that other black neighborhoods in America did not have during that era. He was a criminal, but he was also, in his own way, a strategist, a diplomat, and a survivor. The trip to Chicago in 1936, the 73 days that transformed him from a street enforcer into a power broker, was the defining moment of his life. It was the moment he realized that violence alone couldn't protect Harlem. That respect in the underworld wasn't about fear, it was about value. The Italian mob had mocked Harlem, yes. They dismissed it as irrelevant, as territory to be exploited. But Bumpy Johnson went to Chicago and came back with something they couldn't dismiss: legitimacy. A network. A system. He didn't defeat the Italians. He made them respect him. And in the world he operated in, that was more valuable than any victory. Today, Harlem has changed beyond recognition. The numbers racket is gone, replaced by state lotteries. The tenements where Bumpy once collected tribute are now luxury condos. The social clubs where deals were made are now coffee shops and boutiques. But the lessons remain. Power, real power, isn't about domination. It's about structure. It's about proving you're more valuable as a partner than as a victim. It's about walking into a room where you're not supposed to belong and making them understand that you've earned your seat. Bumpy Johnson understood that. And that understanding, more than any act of violence or defiance, is why he became a legend. Because in the end, the Italian mob didn't destroy Harlem. And Harlem didn't destroy the Italian mob. They coexisted. Uneasily. Dangerously. But they coexisted. And the man who made that possible was a kid from Charleston with a bump on his head and a refusal to accept that respect was something only other people deserved. If you made it this far, you've spent the last half hour with one of the most fascinating and complicated figures in American crime history. If this story resonated with you, whether you're here for the history, the strategy, or just the raw human drama of it all, consider subscribing. There are dozens of stories like this one, buried in forgotten archives and whispered about in old neighborhoods. And every week we bring one of them back to life. No dramatization, no speculation, just research, context, and the cold, complicated truth. Bumpy Johnson's story didn't end with his death in 1968. In many ways, it was just beginning. Within hours of his collapse at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue, word spread through Harlem like a shockwave. By nightfall, every policy station, every after-hours club, every street corner where runners operated had heard the news. Bumpy was gone. The reaction was complex. Some mourned. Others calculated. A few celebrated quietly, because Bumpy's death left a vacuum, and vacuums in the underworld are never empty for long. Within a week, there were 3 funerals. The first was the official one, a service at Abyssinian Baptist Church, attended by more than 1,000 people. Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., a controversial figure himself, gave a eulogy that carefully avoided mentioning Bumpy's criminal activities while acknowledging his complicated relationship with his community. The second funeral was smaller, held in a private room at a Lenox Avenue social club. Only a few dozen people attended. Older men, mostly, who had worked with Bumpy over the decades. They drank whiskey, told stories, and made quiet promises to protect what he'd built. The third funeral was the one that mattered most to the underworld. It wasn't a funeral at all. It was a meeting. Representatives from the 5 families, the remnants of the Chicago outfit, and independent operators from Philadelphia, Detroit, and Miami gathered in a Midtown Manhattan hotel suite to discuss the future of Harlem. The message was clear. Bumpy Johnson had kept Harlem stable. Without him, that stability was not guaranteed. What happened next was predictable and tragic. By 1970, Harlem was fully in the grip of the heroin epidemic. The Italian families, no longer restrained by Bumpy's influence, flooded the neighborhood with product. Distribution networks that Bumpy had spent years keeping separate for narcotics were now used almost exclusively for heroin. The numbers racket collapsed. Not because people stopped playing, they didn't, but because the infrastructure fell apart. Runners became addicts. Bookkeepers were arrested or killed. Police, no longer receiving payoffs from a centralized operation, cracked down indiscriminately. By 1975, Harlem's policy racket generated less than $5 million annually, a tenth of what it had been in Bumpy's era. But something else happened in the 1970s that Bumpy had not anticipated. The rise of a new generation of black gangsters who rejected the old rules entirely. Frank Lucas, one of Bumpy's former drivers, built a heroin empire by cutting out the Italian middlemen and importing directly from Southeast Asia through military contacts during the Vietnam War. Lucas's operation was brutal, efficient, and enormously profitable, and operated without the political protection or community relationships that Bumpy had carefully cultivated. Lucas was eventually arrested and convicted in 1975, sentenced to 70 years in prison, later reduced. His story, like Bumpy's, was later turned into a Hollywood film, American Gangster, starring Denzel Washington. But the mythology around Frank Lucas obscures an important truth. His empire lasted less than a decade. Bumpy Johnson's influence lasted 30 years. Why? Because Bumpy understood that the game wasn't just about money. It was about sustainability, about building systems that could survive federal investigations, internal betrayals, and market shifts. Lucas built an empire on personal control and direct supply. When he was arrested, the entire operation collapsed overnight. Bumpy built a network, and even after his death, pieces of that network survived into the 1980s. But there's another part of the legacy that's harder to quantify: the psychological impact. Bumpy Johnson proved something that many people, both inside and outside the black community, didn't believe was possible in the 1930s and 40s. That a black man could negotiate with the most powerful criminal organizations in the world and not only survive, but thrive. He wasn't the first black gangster. He wasn't the richest, or the most violent. But he was the first to operate at the highest levels of the American underworld as something other than a subordinate. That mattered, not just to criminals, but to everyone who saw the underworld as a mirror of the legitimate world. A world where power was hoarded by white elites and access was controlled by gatekeepers who looked nothing like the people they ruled over. Bumpy Johnson kicked the door open, not with violence, though he was capable of it, but with strategy, intelligence, and an unshakable belief that respect was something that could be earned, not just given. Did he exploit his community? Yes. Did he profit from addiction, poverty, and desperation? Indirectly, yes. But did he also provide jobs, protection, and a sense of pride in a neighborhood that had been systematically abandoned by legitimate institutions? Also, yes. The moral calculus of Bumpy Johnson's life is impossible to resolve cleanly. He was a product of his time, his circumstances, and his choices, some brilliant, some brutal. But here's what's not ambiguous. The trip to Chicago in 1936 changed everything. It was the moment when a street enforcer became a strategist, when a local tough guy became a national figure, when Harlem stopped being just another neighborhood and became a power center. The Italians mocked Harlem. They saw it as a market, not a partner. They assumed control was inevitable. And then Bumpy Johnson went to Chicago, learned how the game was really played, and came back with a blueprint that would protect Harlem for a generation. That's not mythology. That's history. And it's a history worth remembering. Not because it's glamorous, but because it's real. Because it shows what happens when underestimated people refuse to accept the roles they've been assigned. When they study the systems designed to keep them out, and then find ways to navigate those systems on their own terms. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, but the question he answered in 1936 still resonates. Can power be earned, or only inherited? He proved it could be earned. And in doing so, he became a legend. Not because he was a hero, but because he was unignorable.